All right. I hope everybody's having a wonderful time. Maybe you can raise a hand to say, yes, I'm having a great time. And we can continue with our program for the day. Thank you to all the amazing speakers that we've had so far, and to Josh, obviously, for playing amazing tunes. Zoom is a little bit funny with the music, so sometimes there were some periods when you couldn't hear anything, but never mind. Still great tunes. So we're ready for the next speaker. I'm super happy and very honored to welcome Maxwell Colonna-Dashwood as our fourth speaker for today. He is the former three times UK Barista Champion. He co-wrote a very influential book called Water for Coffee. He was one of the first specialty roasters to put specialty coffee into Nespresso compatible capsules, and he has since launched his own capsule machine called Opal. And he recently launched Peak Water, a really cool device that helps you to find the perfect water for brewing using different minerals and salts. And today he's going to join us to talk about the topic of extraction, something that is very nice as a continuation of our previous presenter, Joanna Alm, when we talk about finding that perfect sweet spot for coffee. I can see he's already there. Hey, Maxwell, nice to see you.
Nice to see you too, Alex. How's your day been?
Yeah, it's been amazing so far. Thank you so much for joining us today. The speakers have been really great, and it's very nice to see you already positioned in your roastery. So without further ado,
it's nice. There's no one here, so it only happens on a Sunday. So it's quite nice to be. It's nice to be here on my own.
Maybe just briefly before we dive into your presentation about extraction, I'd love to hear how things are going for you. And are you guys already reopened in the UK? Because it's been kind of a little bit difficult to know what the status is of the lockdowns in the UK.
No, of course. Yeah, I think, funnily enough, some of the cafes stayed open the whole time for takeaway, especially if they were bakeries.
Yeah.
We reopened Clara & Smalls in Bath about 3 weeks ago for takeaway only. And then on July 4th, restaurants and pubs and cinemas can reopen, but with lots of very stringent measures. So, for example, I think you'll have to take the temperature of every single customer who comes through the door. So I think when I speak to cafes, a lot of them just want to stay doing takeaway because it's going to be too much hassle to do sit down. But we feel very lucky. We feel very lucky that so much support online. And also launching Peak, which, a very strange turn of events, was kind of a good time to launch it with everyone at home.
Yeah.
So we feel lucky that of course we've been affected, but we're doing all right. Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah, I have to say that's kind of the same feedback I heard from cafes in Amsterdam who were pretty much open the entire time, just doing takeaway, and they were quite happy serving customers.
Takeaway. I think the sad truth is takeaway coffee is much more profitable. So it's a bit of a kick in the teeth for the reusable cup movement, but I mean, you can still do that too, but it's some of the cafes are realizing that, takeaway is actually, a very good way to run the business. So it's kind of a strange learning. Yeah.
Indeed. All right. So Maxwell, we're going to dive into your wonderful presentation on extraction. I'm going to disappear for now, and we'll see you again in about 20 to 25 minutes. I can't wait to hear what you've got to say.
Yeah, I'm going to try and keep it in 20 to 25 minutes.
Otherwise, we'll cut you off. All right, over to you.
Pleasure. So Alex actually asked me whether I'd be interested in talking about this topic because it's requested so much, and that's very telling to me. I think a lot of people hear the term, and it's presented in a very matter-of-fact way. Extraction equals X, Y, Z, and this is how it works. My presentation today is really about challenging that, which I don't think will be a big surprise for a lot of people. I think a lot of people will probably are confused by extraction. There's a good reason for that. It's a simple term, but you can't really talk about extraction without considering lots of other variables. And it's a great example of actually how frustrating coffee is. When I work with academics and researchers, as they begin to realize all the variables, they realize it's very hard to create standardized tests in coffee because there's so many moving parts, so many levers. But I'm going to start with what I think most people in coffee mean when they use the term extraction and the common metrics that we would use, such as TDS and extraction percentage. And then I'm going to go a little bit further and challenge how useful those metrics are, what they do tell us, but also kind of really importantly, what they don't tell us, culminating in brewing a coffee, ideally to the same extraction, but to taste completely different, merely by altering grind. And I'll talk about why. So, extraction. I would say that when we use this term mostly in coffee, we're referring quite simply to dissolving solids from the coffee and some volatile aromatics into water. Water is the solute and the coffee, the solvent, and the coffee is the soluble. So you could actually use other things. You could use oil even, but it doesn't taste very good. So every time we make coffee, whether it's espresso or filter coffee, that's what we're doing. It's very, very simple. And then when I got into coffee originally about 13 years ago, it was just very much a simple sort of time-based idea. And there's a lot of truth in this idea that the volatile aromatics are very easy to extract, complex compounds. And then these sort of less volatile, heavier compounds come out later, which is where this concept of under and over extraction comes from. And then when you have that concept in your head, you start to go, oh, okay, it therefore makes sense that somewhere in the middle is an optimal extraction. But you're probably also confused by how much that number changes depending on method and what people are talking about. And that's really what I want you to take away from my talk today is you can't really consider a term like extraction without context. I think there's lots of terms in coffee you can't consider without context, which makes it very difficult to learn about because you want to teach people about that one idea, but you can't explain that one idea without explaining lots of others. So what does TDS mean, total dissolved solids? The most common way to measure this is a refractometer. And really, it's not actually measuring the total dissolved solids. What it's measuring is the refraction of light. We are then making an assumption and doing a calculation that if most compounds in coffee reflect light in a certain way, a certain amount of refraction will equal a good approximation of how much has been dissolved. But that in and of itself doesn't actually tell you anything about extraction. It just tells you that there's a concentration in that beverage. Just to be clear, you could use a refractometer to measure the concentration of salt in water, but you'd have to change the refractive index. So you could use it for lots of different things. And the only way we can figure out how much is extracted is if we take that TDS number and we also know how much coffee we started with and the amount of water. So we can use that concentration to understand that a certain percentage of the coffee was dissolved into the water. Sounds quite complex, but relatively simple. Oh, yeah. I'm not sure. I was just trying to read a message there. I'm a bit too far away to do that. So sorry, Alex. This number we start to talk about as a fixed point. And I think, first of all, does every coffee taste the best at the same extraction? Well, no. It's quite easy to kind of prove that, but there is a range. And then the range changes with things like grinders and roast. But in particular, for me, the danger of this number is the suggestion that it is extraction percentage that dictates flavor in the cup. I.e., let's take some filter coffee, for example. I could grind an AeroPress fine, and I would then need to brew it for a shorter amount of time, compared to grinding coarse, which is less surface area, harder for the water to extract, so I have to brew it for longer. And if you're applying this theory, you kind of go, okay, well, I can change lots of things, time, temperature, grind, and I should be able to achieve the same extraction. You can achieve a similar number, but you never achieve a similar taste. And this has always sort of baffled me over the years, and it made me become fascinated in a few things. Obviously, the water you're using is going to have a big impact on how the coffee tastes, and therefore the extraction you prefer. So in the most simple way, you could brew a bowl or 2 cups of coffee with the same coffee, the same method, and a different water. The extraction number's the same, but the extraction is not the same because the water changed the composition of that extraction. But that one's quite, when you explain that to people, they understand it and it's quite obvious. Let's go through some of the others. So temperature is interesting. I mean, quite recently, a lot of people have done videos and talks on about the fact that, it's very hard to brew a coffee with too hot water if it's an AeroPress, a cafetiere, or a pour over. Whereas with espresso, with that continual amount of heat, you can keep that. But the temperature definitely allows you to extract different things. And really, it's finding where you think it extracts the desirable things, with cold brew being the best example of an extreme version of how different temperatures extract different compounds. So temperature is obvious. A lot of people have known about that for a long time. Obviously, steep time. Agitation is an interesting one because obviously the more you agitate it, you help the water extract the coffee. And that's interesting because you could use less water or a coarser grind to achieve the same extraction by compensating with agitation. So these are all really the tools of the barista, right? Sort of what's my ratio, what's my, what's my process, how do I agitate, etc. The biggest thing I'm going to focus on today in my demonstration is grind. And I want to use this as the example of how extraction numbers are limited. So that concept I told you about before, if we grind coarser and brew for longer, we should achieve the same extraction. It just doesn't taste anywhere near the same. And for years, I've always struggled with, why does a cupping table taste so good? And why does the Americano taste, in my opinion, at least different, maybe not so good? And of course, you think about things like, well, it's an espresso machine and it's pressure and there was crema in there and these other variables. I think with the research I'm currently involved in, I would say more than ever, it's grinding, okay? And the one that really got me to think about that was lungos. So a lungo is still a relative amount of pressure, less pressure than espresso because the grind's coarser, so the water passes through faster. But it just tastes so much brighter, closer. We're moving back towards that clean, bright version that we taste on the cupping table. And the project I'm working on is basically about heat damage. I call it heat damage because if I think that the cleanest, most aromatic cup is on the coarsest grind on the cupping table, then as we grind finer and finer and finer, we create more heat, and we basically damage the aromatics in the coffee. Just to give you a quick example, in our tests, a lot of the time we measure heat from a grinder, we're measuring it as it comes out, not at the burr. And on certain grinder models, typical on-counter bar grinders in espresso bars, you will have, you'll have to excuse, you can definitely hear the weather in here. You will have a very high temperature at the point of grinding, and the finer you grind, the more heat you generate, to the point where you can generate upwards of 160 degrees Celsius at the point of grinding. Now, why am I telling you all this? It's a talk about extraction, not grinding. It's because you cannot separate the two. And really what you're saying here, whether it's the water or the grind, is that you can only extract what flavors are there, right? Using the water and your method. Now, so that is the rain. So what happens is the finer we grind, the more heat we create, the more we damage the aromatics in the coffee. Now, this actually explains why freezing coffee has become a thing. So when we started the freezing project, and we were really just so focused on particle distribution. Now, you understand where this comes from. This comes from the fact that it's very clear that a finer grind creates more surface area and allows us to extract more. A coarser grind is harder to extract from. Therefore, it's very logical that looking at particle distribution should tell us something about extraction. One of the challenges I had is this: when the EK43 came along and it tastes clean and bright, and in my opinion, better than most grinders, but its particle distribution didn't look particularly special. There were other grinders that were similar. And actually, it produces less heat. And that means that it damages the coffee less at the point of grinding, especially for espresso. Just to be clear, it's quite easy to make filter coffee and not overly damage the coffee because you don't need to grind that fine. It's espresso that's so difficult. And so what this made us realize was that even though when the coffee goes through that grinder frozen and you get slightly finer grind because it's more brittle, it's a very small difference. If you look at that academic paper online, it's not a huge difference. The main difference is that the frozen, the fact the coffee's so cold is it stops it being so heat damaged as it passes through the grinder. And what's interesting about this is heat damage, if we call it that, definitely affects aromatic coffees more. If you've played around with freezing, I think you'll notice that something like a very chocolatey round Brazil, I mean, frozen, unfrozen, it's quite close. Something like an anaerobic fermentation, Gesher or Sidra, big difference. Much more of the aromatics, much brighter, much cleaner when it's frozen. So I wanted to do this example. I'm going to start getting this going during this talk of brewing 2 AeroPresses. For a long time in our shop in Bath, we were trying to brew quickly to maintain the aromatics, the volatiles that are released when the coffee brews. And then as I began to realize that grinding finer was having such an impact on the quality of the flavor and the extraction, because what is the extraction if it's not the flavor you've extracted into the water? This is my challenge with this term, extraction. And it takes me all the way back to the water project when we did the TDS of water. It's exactly the same idea. I can measure that there's some stuff in the water, but it doesn't tell me what's in the water. And unfortunately, a refraction number and an extraction number is the same. It tells you that there's a certain amount of stuff that you've dissolved, but it doesn't tell you what. And this is the best example of that I think is easy for people to do at home. So what I want you to do is take any coffee that you have, use an AeroPress, or you could, I think the AeroPress is best because you can grind finer or coarser. It would be very hard to separate the coffee in a French press. And I'm going to brew fine over 1 minute, which is what we were doing before in the shop. And then I'm going to brew coarser over 4 minutes. And I'm going to hit a similar extraction. Obviously, this is actually where a TDS meter is extremely useful to check that you are extracting roughly the same amount of solids. And then we're going to taste them. Every single coffee we tasted in our shop with the longer method, blind, was cleaner, sweeter, and we chose to brew it that way. And we moved all of our coffee to being brewed that way. And so from a brew bar point of view, we've improved our extractions merely by making sure we don't damage the coffee when grinding it. Espresso is so much more difficult. And espresso is one of the hardest things to control variables on. So it's extremely hard to know about the quality of your extraction. You know the number, and you can deduce some things about the extraction. Let me just start grinding this. But espresso is full of so many variables that you're chasing your tail all the time, trying to figure out which one is the reason for the slightly better or the slightly worse flavor. I think back to the UK again, it's a great example of that extraction number. So we used to use some Malkonig grinders, the Malkonig Air. Just going to grind again, but coarser. Make sure I change it. Here we go. Right, let's get that one brewing first, because that is going to be the longest brew. And we used to hit, we'd really struggled to hit 20% extractions. And then we moved to the EK43, and the extractions were very fast. They brewed fast, which would suggest under extraction, not enough contact time. And this was where this real riddle that started around grinders for me, is that our fast shots of 15 to 20 seconds were yielding very high extractions, like 24, 25%. In fact, there was an academic paper published recently about this, lots of people involved. That whole paper began at our coffee shop in Bath when we were getting these results, and I shared that with Chris, who is Christopher H. Hendon, who I wrote Water for Coffee with, and he had then took and collaborated that idea with people, and they recently published that paper. But what's so important about it is it only works when a grinder performs in a certain way. And that's what's amazing, is if you can grind everything finer, the boulders actually normally cause a barrier, right? So the slowest grind is an uneven grind. And so if everything's fine, theoretically that can produce a faster shot because there's less boulders in the way. Right? If you just have boulders on their own, then it would go through very fast, because boulder meets boulder creates gap, water goes through. But boulder sat in a bunch of fines creates a blockade, right? Here we go. I'm just doing the regular 60 grams per litre ratio for this. Here we go. And so what we did, I would give it one little stir, not too much agitation. We don't want to test agitation on this one. And so our extractions went up and our coffee got too strong. We were using 18-gram baskets and we were pouring them into Demeter's espresso cups. And suddenly from the same 18 grams, we were getting more coffee in the cup. And this was because the EK was doing a better job at grinding all that coffee up. So that's when we went down to 15 grams, because we actually wanted to serve the same size beverage at the same strength. And that's a crazy idea, that you're getting this same strength from less coffee, which is very interesting, right? And so that extraction is higher, 24%, but the TDS is similar. And that's actually a separate topic, but that approach is going to have a huge impact on the sustainability of coffee, because it is coffee, the growing of coffee, that has the biggest impact as a carbon footprint, much more than the transport or the packaging. And so if we can extract coffee better, we can make it more sustainable. Right, I'm going to see if I can focus on talking to you whilst keeping an eye on these two brews. Probably not, to be honest. It's been a while since I did barista competitions. So I'm going to just make sure I press this one at the right time. This coffee is a Rocky Mountain Gesher, so a very aromatic coffee. I think, like I said, I think it's those kinds of coffees display that loss of aromatics from finer grinds the best. And so what happened in that instance was a 24% extraction tasted amazing in the context of that grinder brewed in that way, but that didn't taste amazing with another grinder. Even the EK generates heat. The grinders out there that generate the least heat are roller grinders, but there are a few countertop on the marketplace, but generally roller grinders are found in big factories grinding for capsules and big commercial companies. I was just talking about the challenges of espresso extraction. It's very difficult to figure out which variable is causing the inconsistency in your brews. And I still think all coffee professionals are chasing their tails, myself included, people I work with, and with still a lot to figure out in coffee with so many complex variables. But one of the most consistent brewers I've seen for extraction is actually based in Amsterdam, funnily enough. And it's a concept called Spin, which had a Kickstarter. It's SPINN, and it's a centrifugal brewing system. And the thing is, espresso is unique because you brew at pressure, but it's the pressure that causes the problem, because the coffee needs to pass evenly and extract evenly through this bed of coffee. The higher the pressure, the harder that is. Centrifugal brewing is basically mixing the coffee like an AeroPress, but creating pressure through a centrifuge, which in turn gives you that crema. It's an amazing device. It can create espresso crema or a filter coffee all from the same system. But the best way to learn about extraction is to try and shut certain variables off. But we must all remember that any environment we're in, we are setting some variables, and that is our context. So when I did the water thing, for example, you use a reverse osmosis system, and you take the water down to 80 ppm. And then you do a tasting of 80, 120, 160. And the false learning there is that 80 ppm tastes best as a fact. What you learned is that particular water in that location at 80 ppm tasted best on that day. And it's the same with grinding. I feel like you have to have the context of the brewing parameters to understand quality of extraction. And I would actually say, for me, those other parameters are more important in telling me how the coffee is going to taste than the traditional concept of an extraction percentage. Okay, so I'm going to taste these now. And you can't taste them, so I could just be lying to you. But trust me, I'm honest. I mean, they're clearly different. The finer grind it's got more of that cellulose taste. What most people would typically say is a roasty flavor, whereas the coarser grind left to brew for longer is just much more delicate, bright, and clean. And in this research that I've been involved in, I think there's probably an interesting truth for people to come to terms with. You can't have it all. And I think we all knew this about coffee extraction anyway. It's like, okay, I roast it a bit darker. I get more of this, but less of this. And the same when you learn to brew. I extract more and I get some flavors I like, but actually I also like some of the flavors when I extracted less. And so in this case, less damaged coffee is definitely more aromatic. But I believe that damage, that breaking down that happens at high temperatures when you grind fine, also allows you to have more body, simply by making it easier for the water to dissolve some of that cellulose. And so that's why I'm a bit funny about calling it heat damage, because I think some people might like the flavor of that damage, especially in espresso, because espresso is so concentrate, of course, right? Come and have a little taste. You'll see peak water. This is my plug. I mean, Alex already plugged it for me, but obviously I brewed it with peak water. Yeah, it's night and day for me. And the reason I would call it heat damage is the character of the coffee shine. It may have less body, but the character of the coffee shines through more. But my real point here isn't really about grinding per se. It's using grinding as an example that talking about extraction purely as a number has its flaws. It is useful and we can use it as one metric, but we have to understand these other key elements. And I think I'm always learning in coffee, and I've learned a lot of this very, very recently. And there's so many conundrums that we still don't fully understand. And the term extraction, I think, will be a confusing one for some time to come, but it's just about learning what goes into extraction and discussing extraction wider than a percentage of coffee diluted into water. Well, dissolved into water, sorry. And so that is my talk about extraction. I can say a lot more about extraction, but I feel like there might be some questions. It might be best to answer some of these questions. What do you think, Alex?
All right. Thank you, Maxwell. I'm just, I was a little bit taken aback by your sudden end there. So let me just.
Oh yeah, that's okay.
That's okay.
I can keep drinking coffee if you like.
Perfect. All righty. So thank you so much for this really, really interesting talk, and for showing us how you brew coffee with the AeroPress using those different grind sizes. I think it's super interesting to go a little bit deeper into this, because this is actually something that people can probably recreate quite easily at home, even if you don't have a TDS or a refractometer. You can still do a taste comparison using the two different brew methods and recipes. So maybe, if you don't mind, maybe you can also share with us, so we can share this with everyone later, what exactly it is that you used in terms of grams, in terms of grind size, and extraction time for everyone to recreate later. So I would love to hear a little bit about how this actually is in terms of implementing this on a commercial level, so to speak, in your cafes, because if you brew something for 4 minutes versus 1 minute, of course that also makes the whole process a lot longer, and potentially for your baristas also a lot longer, more time consuming. How do you sort of integrate that easily into your cafe? Because I know a lot of cafes struggle with offering filter because they just don't have the time.
No, I agree. I think the good thing about any kind of immersion method, though, is there is that time to leave it to brew where you can do other things. I mean, obviously, a pour over would take, let's say, 2.5 to 4 minutes, depending. And then that requires the barista to be in attendance the whole time. So actually what our baristas found was longer brew methods were actually more efficient for them, because they could press the timer, leave it and come back. Whereas if they have to be there to press it every minute, they actually gave them no spare time. So I mean, still a brew bar is always going to be a problem, right? Compared to espresso. I mean, you just can't create the same throughput. But I think actually the brew bar is the place you can experiment. I think it's the same with freezing, right? The idea of doing all your espresso frozen is like, whoa, but you can easily play around with that on your brew bar because it's a smaller percentage of sales. And I think that's where you can play. My real goal commercially, which is a project I'm involved in, which I won't be able to share too much on, is can you get these results of grinding coarse and those flavor profiles whilst grinding fine and making espresso efficiently in a cafe? I think some of the biggest challenge to serve for cafe operations is grinding for espresso. I still think that's sort of the next frontier for improvement.
Definitely. Do you have any kind of suggestions, or are there any interesting projects going on that would, for example, introduce some kind of like frozen container or like a freezer on top of your grinder that you can actually get to those results?
I think freezing is going to be very hard. You can obviously, some shops will have, expensive coffees frozen. And I also, just quickly, I'm on a couple of these WhatsApp sort of Instagram groups discussing storage. Although freezing is interesting, it still seems to have its problems. It does elongate life, but there is some degradation of flavor as well. So actually, when I freeze coffee, and when a lot of people do it at Barista Championships, they're not doing it to keep it for a long life. They're just freezing it on the day to make it grind better, right? So I actually think the solution isn't to integrate freezing. It's to design grinders that don't overheat. So then you don't need the freezing to combat the heat. That is much easier said than done. You just smashing, by the way, it's the coffee that generates the heat. It's not the grinder. So smashing something up into tiny bits just generates heat. So it's how can you reduce that? It's a challenge for sure. Like the project I'm involved in is probably a couple years off. And I think a lot of people I've seen more and more people recognize that is a thing and that is a problem, but solving it is a different challenge. Yeah.
All righty. Cool. I think we have a lot of questions from the audience. So why don't we jump into the first one? Michael?
What grind setting on the Wilfa did you use for the two brews?
Okay.
Yeah. So absolutely.
Question?
I did, yeah. Which
great.
settings did I use on the Wilfer? Yeah. So I used to sort of prove the point of a fine grind. I did use the finest setting on the Wilfer for the quick brew. I probably should have brewed it a bit quicker, maybe 30 seconds. And then I used just the one right of the French press. So I didn't make it fully coarse, because you just wouldn't be able to extract enough in the 3 minutes, unless, of course, I was doing something like agitation. And one thing people might bring up and question is they say, well, it's all very fine saying it's the grind, but isn't the temperature dropping in the 3 minute brew versus the shorter brew? That is true. You can, I've done this test multiple times using a heat source underneath to keep it hot, and it maintains the same difference. I really believe it's that a lot of things we think are other things like pressure or temperature are actually just grind. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. We had a question from Klaus about hand grinders and whether they have the same issue that you just described with more commercial grinders.
No, they're better. So hand grinders, unless you're really strong and fast, just will not generate as much heat. But it's actually, that doesn't mean they solve the problem. It is these traditional burr grinder designs, when you go fine, all create heat damage, but a variance of it. So the EK, it turns out, I think a lot of people have been trying to figure out why the EK is better for a long time, and I think it is. It does generate less heat for quite a few complex reasons, actually. It's not just simply that it has big burrs. But yeah, hand grinders will be better for that problem, for sure.
Wonderful. Do we have more questions, Michael?
Yes, sure. So on the first festival, we had, of course, a speaker about water, and
yep.
Now the question about water is coming back. So what is the best water for brewing coffee?
What is the best water for brewing coffee? Quite a few people asked this question.
Have you read my book, Michael?
No, unfortunately, but it's still on.
Michael?
Send it over.
Please
no,
ahead.
It's actually, I'm not trying to be difficult. It's something when we started that project and we learned about water, it's something I pushed back really hard on, this idea of a perfect water, right? Because everything for me suggests that there isn't one. And it's another variable. And there's too much of a complex feedback loop. So we started off the project by going, oh, these minerals do X. And then calcium, magnesium, bicarbonate in particular became very clear as the most impactful. And then you start to ask that question, okay, well, what's the best water then? And then the problem we hit very quickly was different coffees roasted to taste good with different waters. And for a long time, we talked about that. And then what I realized is brewing champions would build their own water to go to World Brewers Championships, is that different coffees benefit different waters, to the degree where in my roastery and my cafe, I do two things. I make sure the water's different in the cafe to the roastery, because I think it's really dangerous as a roastery to funnel all your coffee roasting to taste good in one specific environment, which other people don't have. And second of all, aromatic delicate coffees like Gesher and Sidra and Sudan Rume I will go and use peak water and take out nearly all the minerals. And it will have less body, but that's okay because it's a tea-like coffee. Any bicarbonate will lower your aromatics, right? But if you make something like a Colombian coffee or a Kenyan, they're so sour without any minerals that you need those. So, you know, in the peak water manual, we give people a couple of suggestions about the different waters you could use for different varieties. And I would go a step further. And the one thing that's become clear to me over the last 4 or 5 years since we wrote that book is lots of other people around the world have been testing things themselves, lots of interesting people, different backgrounds, copy people, engineers, and contributing. And it's become very clear that you cannot think about the mineral content just as a ppm without the context of the brew method. And so I'll explain that, which is when you talk about ppm, it's misleading because you say, okay, there are 40 parts per million. Okay, that just tells you per million there's X number. It doesn't tell you how much water you're using. So if you had 40 parts per million of bicarbonate and you make a filter coffee, you're using 200 mil of water with that mineral. So there's more overall minerals when you make that filter. You then go make espresso coffee, you're using way less water, therefore less minerals. But in fact, they go against each other because espresso is concentrate with way more acid and you've used less minerals. Filter coffee is very dilute with way more minerals. So what happens is the coffee, the waters that people prefer to make filter coffee with have a lower amount of total minerals per million, but then similar for the overall. And then espresso coffee, you can actually get away with a lot harder water to make the espresso balanced. The problem there is then you get a scale in your machine. So again, not just with grinding, but with water, espresso is this very frustrating beast.
It's a big challenge.
I personally would go for a bit of scale and make the coffee taste nicer, but you know, that's me.
All right. We'll leave that up to everyone to decide for themselves how they want to do that. But let's go to the next question.
So a question from Peter Summers. What are your thoughts on modified atmosphere storage? An example, nitrogen or CO2?
Okay.
The storage of roasted coffee, is that?
I would think so.
Yeah. What do I think? Lots of things. Again, I think, so the reason I won't commit to a perfect water and the reason I won't commit to a lot of things in coffee is if the data isn't conclusive, then it's not conclusive. And actually there's a lot of bias, confirmation bias in coffee. We want a certain roast to taste better. We want a certain piece of packaging to taste better. And in the studies I've been involved in with freshness, which is an interesting term because do we mean freshness? Because obviously the freshest coffee is the coffee that just came out of the roaster. Or do we mean sort of optimal flavors or retention of flavors? Nitrogen is extremely good at keeping flavor in a bag and in a capsule. Funnily enough, CO2, I think CO2 is one of the most misunderstood gases in coffee, right? Because when you age coffee for too long, that sort of fizz on your mouth is just a complete loss of CO2. You want a bit of CO2 to give it a bit of vibrancy. There's been a lot of focus on how you have too much when it comes out of a roaster. But from a packaging point of view, the valves, in my work in grocery and retail, I don't think anyone ever put that valve on to make coffee taste better. They just put it on because they didn't want the coffee to blow up on the shelf. That's it. And actually, CO2 acts as a natural preserver for coffee. This being said, there appears to be, like Vac-Pack in particular, appears to keep the coffee for longer, but then when you open the Vac-Pack, degrade it quicker. And it all depends what you're saying. Like if you had to keep a coffee for 3 years, yeah, the Vac-Pack frozen one will taste the best. But if you only had to keep it for 6 weeks, which one tastes best then? And it's not the same methods. So I think there's a lot of open questions. I've seen some good research, but my problem with a lot of research in coffee, which thanks, is Alex telling me to stop talking?
No. I'm just checking. Sorry, my apologies. I just wanted to know how we're doing on time, but because we have so many questions, please go ahead.
So I was going to quickly say, I meant to say it in my speech about what was I talking about? Storage.
Yes. About vacuum pack versus the CO2.
Yeah. Well, sorry. This is what I meant to talk about. I meant to talk about the problem with numbers in coffee are that we work in an industry where ultimately the way you what people like as taste is really what matters. And most of the numbers, we're trying to find a correlation between the number and the taste. The suggestion then is to go and do a scientific study where we measure the compounds. But unless you can also prove that we taste those compounds, it's a pointless study, right? So this happened, I question in some of the storage research I've seen where they picked, say, 3 compounds and measured how they degraded in different packaging, like CO2, nitrogen, argon, vacuum packing, and see how they degrade. But again, I think the fact that we like coffee that's slightly degraded, that's slightly aged, means that I don't think that's probably the best way to test freshness. And we still need to do a lot of work to figure out, a bit like wine's done, what the compounds in the beverage are that we actually taste. Mm-hmm. And at the moment, we still rely so heavily on tasting something to check. We're so far away from being able to use an analytical experiment to tell us whether something's better.
But actually, going on what you just said about the valve in the coffee bags, if CO2 is such a great preservative, but obviously it makes the bag expand, and the reason why people put it in there is they don't want the bags to explode, then how would you potentially solve this issue and keep the CO2 as a preservative without the bag exploding?
Well, that's actually a bit why people use, just quickly though, you've still got oxygen in there, which is the problem. When you bagged it, you've got CO2 and oxygen. We use no valves and have done for a while. The darker you roast, it really is a problem. That's why actually, if you potentially a small amount of degassing before you bag could be better than bagging fresh with a valve.
So you would leave the coffee to rest for a little while before you actually then end up bagging it and selling it?
Yeah, we do that. We do
okay.
24 hours. Yeah.
All right.
But it is a challenge. People, they don't pop unless you roast really dark. They do pop if you roast dark. And then bigger bags are a problem, right? Because if you sell 1 kilo or 2 kilos with a small seal, that's a lot of gas that will break that seal. But retail bags can get away with it. But customers don't like the way it looks. They think something's gone wrong with it.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
All righty. Next question.
The next question, will the effect of heat damage be dependent on the roast profiles too? Like say lighter or darker roast?
Okay. Will the heat damage also depend on the roast profile? So for example, light versus darker roast?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So, I think I've seen a few videos recently talking about temperature in water brewing and saying, well, there's no way that brewing at a boiling temperature can burn the coffee, which I agree with. It just changes extraction. But I actually do believe that the temperatures created in grinders continue that roast process. They make it taste more roasty. So yeah, a lighter roast will deal better with the heat generated when you grind finer and taste less roasty naturally, and compared to a darker roast. But I think all it's doing is adding heat and degradation. So obviously if it's darker, it's going to degrade more on that grinder than a light roast. But I don't know if one or the other would make it less, I don't know whether using a light roast would create a bigger reaction. I think it would you'd just add it on top of whatever the flavor profile was.
Okay, all right. Well, lots of insights there that we can take away and learn more from and learn more about. Do we have time for one more question, or are we out of time?
We have one more minute.
All right, we have one more minute.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good one. Let's do. We have I think 2 polls.
Yeah.
Can you just remind me what they are?
Freshness and extraction.
All right. So one of the things that I find really interesting is when I have conversations with my customers is when we discuss things like freshness. Some people are very adamant about having coffee extremely freshly roasted, and if it's 2 or 3 weeks old, they think it's no longer fresh, it's no longer good. But at the same time, we have this conversation with customers and roasters about sometimes actually La Cabra, for example, told me that they had tasted one of their coffees and it tasted amazing 6 weeks after roasting. What is your position on that?
Yeah, I think La Cabra specifically recommend that their espresso in particular should be left for 6 weeks. And I think they age the coffee now at the roastery so that the wholesale customers get it already rested. I think what I would like is, for me, I said earlier in the talk, everything seems to be a trade-off in coffee. You roast a bit darker, you get some other things, but you lose some other things. I feel the same about this freshness debate. I think that if you could keep the most volatile aromatics are in that bag when it's freshly roasted, right? That's when they're there. And then you're losing them. But some of those, the carbonic acid, and again, we do want to lose some CO2, will happen over time. But then over time, we also lose some of those aromatics. So a bit like, you remember Andre, is it Zimmermann, the Swiss barista champion, who roasted on stage and then aggressively degassed using a vacuum. And I think Ben did a bit of this, put the coffee in and got rid of the acid. I think there's pros, and some fresher coffee has some nicer attributes and rested coffee has some nice attributes. A lot of that seems to be the opinion of the roaster. I do believe, Le Cabra, I actually wish I hadn't missed Joanna's talk on omni roasting, but I think their omni roaster, Le Cabra, will benefit the resting because it softens some of the intensity, which with a lighter roast as espresso is going to be quite acidic, right?
Yeah.
So I guess I don't really have a take on it. I think from the customer's point of view, if we think it's best at 3 weeks, they get it at 3 weeks and then they've got it for 2 weeks. So it's actually 5 weeks by the time they finished. And I still think the customer's problem is they've got to open a bag, right? This is why I think single serve is the ultimate way to prepare coffee for people, because each one is, there you go, I put that in there, rested this long with our capsules, it's like 7 days from roast, in the capsule, nitro flushed, roller ground, there you go. And each one, whereas when you open that bag, it's aging. During lockdown, I've been making coffee at home and I've been getting frustrated with the other methods and the bags that are open. And that was my favorite coffee, but now it's been open 2 weeks and it's oxidized. I probably should have kept it better, to be honest.
Yeah.
So people who get their bag of coffee and then break it out and vacuum seal every single one and put it in the freezer. So I don't know. I feel like we've made I think coffee's made a rod for its own back in the early scene of third wave or independent. We could compete against the supermarket by saying, hey, we roast fresh, come and buy it off us. It's freshly roasted.
Yeah.
And we've taught our customers that that's valuable. And now we're going, is it that valuable? I mean, I agree. I think our coffee nitro flushed in a bag. I think we will move all of Colonna's coffee retail to nitro flushed. And then what we'll do is roast in bigger batches that are more consistent, do it all on one day every 2 weeks, and then sell people nitro flushed coffee over those 2 weeks.
All right.
But of course, I worry about the fact a lot of customers are going to go, why wasn't it roasted fresh? And we're going to have to communicate that. So I don't know, maybe come back to me and see how I got on in 6 months' time to see if I could convince my customers to go away from just having freshly roasted and having, coffee that's been rested and flushed. Yeah.
All right, wonderful. Well, that's a great note to end on. Thank you, Maxwell, for a wonderful and insightful presentation, and very, very happy to hear your thoughts. And we have one last poll for our attendees where we're going to ask them about this topic. And voting is now happening, so you can cast your vote and let us know what you think about freshness and how important it is to you. And we're going to share the results before we go so that Maxwell can take a look and see what people think. So please cast your vote in this little poll that we have now. We'll give it a couple more seconds before we publish the results. And then we'll be able to share the insights of our audience.
I think if you buy it fresh, right, it gives the customer the choice. It's up to them if they rest it, right?
Of course, of course.
Yeah.
So let's see the results.
All right. So I'm sharing results.
Aha.
Wow.
So it is still very important, of course. And I think the winning answer is I don't have my glasses, so I can't really see what's on the screen.
Super important is one. But I think
important.
it's a trick. Yeah, I think it's a trick question, isn't it? This is a trick question. Like, it says it's important to you. It doesn't say, well, what is that date? I mean, knowing the date is important, but it didn't say, is the freshest date closest to roast important for you to buy it? Yeah.
It is true. It is true. I didn't want to go so much into detail in that. It was just a quick temperature check.
I'm just being pedantic, Alex. That's what I do. That seems to be what my career in coffee is. Just
well, it got you to where you are today, and we're grateful that you are there, because it is awesome to have listened to you today. So thank you very much for being part of Virtual Coffee Festival #2. And I just wanted to extend my warmest gratitude to you, Maxwell, and I wish you and your team lots of success in the months to come, and I hope that you come out of this lockdown in the UK as safe and sound, and look forward to tasting some of your coffees again in the near future. Thank you so much, guys.